Back to our trigger. Take everything I mentioned about scalability and shelve it for the rest of this course, because we've got bigger problems. There is something logically wrong about this trigger. I'm not talking syntax or scalability. There is something logically wrong with this trigger. Yes, it'll execute, but the results won't be pretty. Pause the video now if you want to try to figure out why before I tell you. Time for the answer. Here is where this trigger goes wrong. Right here in our SOQL query. Notice this SOQL query has no where clause, meaning it queries every single contact in our org. If our account is updated, we want our trigger to only update its respective contacts, not every single contact in our org. Sure, we could loop through this massive list of contacts and only update the relevant ones, but that would be hugely inefficient for most orgs that have many contacts in them. So we need a where clause in this query. But what would we write in the where clause? We'd need it to be something like this, so we could filter it down to just the contacts related to our account. But we couldn't hardcode some account ID in our query. It would always be different depending on which account was updated. Our where clause would need to be dynamic, always changing as different accounts enter our trigger. That's where our second technique, bind variables, come in. Bind variables let us use Apex variables inside SOQL queries. It gives us that ability to make our query dynamic. And the vast majority of the time, we'll use bind variables inside where clauses to give us just the right records we need at just the right time. Here's how bind variables work. In this SOQL query, we need to filter it down to only contacts belonging to account ACC. It might be tempting to do this in our SOQL query, simply substituting in our ACC variable directly into it. While logically this makes sense, syntactically it doesn't. SOQL gets confused. What's acc.id? Is it a field? Is it a date literal? Is it a typo? SOQL doesn't know how to interpret this syntax because SOQL doesn't know we're trying to include an Apex variable inside it. The key to letting SOQL know we're using an Apex variable, aka a bind variable inside it, we add a colon before our Apex variable. That's it. This colon tells SOQL to switch gears and translate the next input as Apex. And now our trigger works perfectly. That's it. We just added a colon before our Apex variable. This little guy. Yes, I'm talking about this little guy. How can one colon be so powerful? We can use our Apex variables directly in our SOQL queries. We just need to remember to add a colon before them. Wow. Let's take another example of bind variables. The challenge this time? Let's find contacts in our org who are more successful than Mark Benioff. Up top, we'll conveniently store Mr. Benioff's important information in Apex variables. We have his title, CEO, because we need to find other CEOs in our org. We have his birthday, September 25th, 1964, because we need to find younger CEOs than him. We have his net worth, $4.2 billion, because you're going to need at least that much if you want to top Mark Benioff. And finally, we have his donation philosophy stored in a Boolean. Mark Benioff is a noted philanthropist, and we expect others in similar positions to be generous as well. We have our Apex variables ready. Now on to the SOQL. Since our SOQL query will run on the contact object, we begin with a list of contacts called people more successful than Benioff. The query from here is simple and makes effective use of multiple bind variables at once. Each of our Apex variables inside our SOQL query is preceded with the all-powerful colon. And even though our Apex variables are of different data types, they're all just as viable in our SOQL query. Anyway, I ran this query in my org and no results were found. Mark Benioff, you sir are amazing. And don't hesitate to reach out, sir, if you're looking for SOQL lessons. One thing's still bugging me. Earlier on, we wrote a trigger that set a contact's owner to the same owner as its account. Here it is. That trigger never worked because it always attempted to set our contact owner to null. But now that we know how to combine SOQL with Apex, I think we can fix this. Okay, so the problem happens here. This field here isn't in trigger.news memory, so it was always evaluated to be null. Let's take that broken part out of our trigger and fill in the blanks here with our newfound SOQL knowledge. We need two things here. First, we need to query our contact's account owner. There are two possible ways to do this, each equally effective. One way is to write a query on the account table and make sure the account ID is the same as the contact's account ID. This query includes the owner ID field in it because later on we'll need to reference that value. We expect this list to have exactly one account result because IDs in Salesforce are unique. Now we have to set our contact owner to the account owner. Since we know our ACCS list variable has exactly one account inside it, we can use the getZero method to get its first and only account. Don't forget that counting starts at 0 for lists. GetZero got our account record. Now we need to get that account's owner ID. We'll chain our dot notation to pull the owner ID of our account record. And now our trigger undeniably works, and we can all give ourselves a pat on the back. Though there is one more thing I want to teach you about combining SOQL with Apex. It's a shortcut. It was really cumbersome working with a list variable, even though our SOQL query only returned one result. This kind of thing happens often in Apex, so they made a shortcut for us to avoid working with lists. If we know without a shadow of a doubt that our SOQL query will only return one result, we can store it in a SObject variable instead of a list variable, as shown here on the screen. Again, you only want to use this shortcut if you're sure you're only going to get one result. If there's any chance you get more than one result, your trigger will break. That's why I like to put a limit 1 clause at the end of my query just to be safe. You don't need to have it, but it helps me sleep better at night. With the SOQL query results safely stored into an account variable, it makes it that much easier in the next line to set our contact's owner. So, those are the techniques you need to know for combining SOQL and Apex. To recap, there are 3 methods. First, you can store SOQL results in a list of SObjects. Second, you can store SOQL results in a SObject, as long as you're sure there's exactly one result. Third, you can use existing Apex variables inside your SOQL queries as long as you precede these variables with a colon. And that's that. Surprisingly easy if you ask me. You get a lot of power for just a little bit of additional knowledge. But the important part here isn't the syntax. It's how you choose to use SOQL with Apex. And with that, it's demo time.